Yeah, so I worked as a speech pathologist in K-12 schools, in subacute rehab, community transition, early intervention, you name it. I even did a stint over in the UK working with the NHS and doing evaluations for AAC, which is augmentative communication. We're talking about it tonight. But I also have worked in deaf education. I was a teacher of the deaf. I still am a teacher of the deaf, a dyslexia practitioner, an assistive technology consultant, accessibility consultant. And right now I am doing something very different than what I've done before. I used to oversee accessibility and assistive technology for a university system. And now I do that for McDonald's Global. So yeah, it's been a journey.
So yeah, welcome to corporate.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a very different world with very different sort of motivations and stuff, but it's interesting in its own right. And I think us working in corporate and then being able to tell other people in corporate how to work for accessibility, I think it only makes us better and more valuable.
Yeah, I guess having come from education, I never realized that education was more of a business than business in some ways, higher ed in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a lesson learned.
Yeah. So I'm going to totally switch gears on us, get incredibly somber here for a second. And, we're going to talk about a giant what if. Okay, and this is an exercise that we're going to do so that we can actually kind of put ourselves in this sort of position. So what if you go to the doctor's office and you found out you got some bad news at the doctor's office that you have some progressive neuromuscular disorder, like ALS or something, and you've got X amount of time before you find out that you're going to lose your speech. Now, a lot of us here are technology or UX badasses. What are we going to do? Are we going to kind of are we going to kind of give up here? Or would we be like, okay, what can we do with all the tech we have, with all of our UX chops to make this better for ourselves? I mean, what would we do to kind of make the world better for our future selves? Would you adapt? Would you start using assistive technology? Sorry, I've got a lag here. Because this future, the woman on the top left, she looks a little bit somber, but really she's basically using a mouse with her eyes on the screen. She's using eye gaze.
I think she's using a sip and puff.
A sip and puff, but she's watching what's going on the screen. You're right, it's sip and puff. And he's using a switch with his cheek, that he's operating by tilting his head. So there's different ways that you can interact with devices that have been around for a while that most of us are totally unaware of. But tonight, we're going to really start getting into how this works and what sort of devices you can use that are specific to language. So we're not going to focus on sip and puff. We're not going to be talking about switches and that sort of thing, which is really mechanical input devices. We're going to be focusing on language, and we have a fantastic language expert in the house here tonight. So Kelsey, tell us what would make somebody lose their speech?
A lot of different things. I think the easiest way to kind of think about it is that you could be born with a disability of some kind that impacts your ability to use verbal speech. Or secondary, it could be something that you acquire. So through injury, like a brain injury of some kind, or like ALS. And those are really the two main ways that you would kind of experience potential loss of speech or difficulty acquiring verbal speech.
Right.
But it's always a caveat, doesn't mean that we don't have something to say. So I always want to caveat it with that. So speech and communication are different things.
So yeah, and that's what this talk is all about. This is giving a voice to somebody who just doesn't have the ability to speak.
Exactly.
So when you were looking at, for instance, working with clients or people in the system, and end users, and you'd have to do evaluations. What sort of stuff would you look at?
So it's definitely, there's a holistic approach to kind of conceptualizing what would you do for an evaluation when someone's kind of needing your support, and you really look at it holistically. So it always starts with a person, or in this case, human. There is a framework out there called the SET framework, also called the HET framework, whether you're in a school or it's more of an adult situation. So we'll stick with HET. So you kind of want to think about the person, right? And then you want to think about all those pieces that go into that person's everyday life. Where are they? What's their environment? And then you want to think about what are they supposed to be doing? And then you determine the tool. So it's like always like this holistic, and then like a broader view, the 5,000-foot view, and then the dance floor view.
Okay, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, I wish we in UX could always, practice things that sort of
Yeah.
look at environment and tasks and that sort of thing. And a lot of times we kind of get a little bit caught up in our software. But if you were, like if you were doing this with an adult, somebody who's been abled and then is losing their speech, I mean, what are the sort of factors that you'd look at?
Yeah, a lot. I think the first one that always comes to mind, especially when you say an adult, is as adults, of course, we work to make an income to survive. So if someone has acquired an injury, my first question is always, do they have the plan to go back to work? Because if they do, that's going to be really important with like the types of vocabulary we're thinking about and all of that. I'm always looking at what's their physical mobility. How are they moving? Are they in a wheelchair? Are they using a walker? What's been impacted? We also really want to know, if it was a stroke, for example, was their cognitive status impacted? How are they handling multiple inputs at the same time? Their visual status? There's so many pieces. And I think a really important piece to this too is what's their level of independence. So because of a potential acquired injury, do they have a caretaker at home? Is their partner supporting them in caretaking? Or can they do all the things that we'd expect them to do? It's just the loss of speech that exists. So there's a lot of different pieces I'd ask about, but it really also depends on literacy level. I would say that's a big one too, because
like, can they
most
read?
adults, yeah. So if you were able to read before your injury and then suddenly your injury impacted your brain and you couldn't, that's going to really determine the kind of device we go with.
Yeah. And then there's a whole tech thing, like with our parents, like, can they fix their own devices?
Yes,
or
yeah.
are they going to call you every single time they want to do something basic, like find the internet,
Yeah. And to your point before, when you were saying like, there's so many different access methods, is it challenging for them to access their device in multiple ways to like be able to get into the programming of it? Like, does their device compatibility work with the settings of the device, or is it different? So there's so many different layers, and the hope is always independence, right?
Right. Yeah. Right.
So yeah, it's tricky.
So if we were to take this and kind of like switch this over to a kid,
yeah,
what sort of factors would you look at, if you're choosing something for them?
Yeah. And, I was just thinking about this, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but, with a kid, a big factor is just thinking about partially who's going to fund it. So are they school age is a really important question, because that adds a whole layer of protection around insurance and all of that. So that's something that we want to know. Is this early intervention kid, or is this school age kid? Are they literate? How old are they? And, where are they in their journey of schooling? Some of the questions are the same, like where's their cognitive status, and what do we anticipate, their outcomes will be with schooling. Self-care is really important. What age are they? Is it developmentally appropriate that they're caring for themselves, or are they just kind of, are they 16 and something happened and they've acquired this as well?
Oh,
so
wow.
Physical mobility is important. Yeah, it's, I've had a lot of students who acquired injuries later on, in their K-12 career. So it's definitely a life shift, and you're always trying to think ahead too with kids, a lot because of funding, but you want to think, okay, where I anticipate they are today, kids change so rapidly, unlike adults. So where do I anticipate they'll be in just a few years, which is going to be vastly different than someone who might be 65 who acquired an injury.
Mm-hmm. So any other sort of environmental factors, like,
yes,
like where the device is, how you mount it on the wheelchair, how big the device is.
Yeah, a lot of these devices are massive. So depending on the needs of the student, a lot of AAC users experience the need for more complex like wheelchairs and things. So that means that they're going to have to get some really complex like Frankenstein, sometimes mounting systems that can be really bulky. And so you're thinking about, okay, this has to go to school, it has to go to therapy, it has to go home. So there's a lot of different layers.
Right. And you're in New England right now, where it's not exactly like you have huge rooms and wide doors and stuff.
No, we're like colonial over here.
Exactly.
And then winter's coming. So we've got, snow and not great sidewalks and danger. So
yeah, getting around is not the easiest thing.
No.
So yeah, one of the things we wanted to cover tonight was getting into like all the different visual systems and stuff, and all the different symbols, and this area is particularly kind of interesting for anybody who's a designer, because it's like different ways in which you try to represent language in ways that are very, very different from the sort of visual icons and visual languages that we're used to. So
yeah, I think this is an opportunity for sure.
Oh, big
I
time.
mean, up on the screen, this is it's around 1920. So we've got the first known AAC device, augmentative and alternative communication device, speech generating device, whatever you want to call it. It's up on the screen, and it's a lot of words, phrases, letters. And so you even notice in the bottom right, there's a like SHHHH, like to shush somebody. So, obviously it's the 20s, so technology is not in a place where you're going to be able to have access to the speech output side of things, but this was the first opportunity to communicate in some way. However, I don't know if you want to move on from here.
I just think it's so interesting that they would have I can hear perfectly right there in the most prominent position. As in, like, I am not a dumbass. Don't start saying things about me in front of me that are insulting.
And oh my God. Yeah. And that happens still to this day. So actually, I think that's a brilliant one that I had never programmed specifically into a student's device or an adult's device. But I don't know. It's a button that needs some more, stage time.
So 100 years forward, okay, we're going to see such a huge difference.
Wow. 100 years. All right. So welcome to 2020. If we did a back and forth, 1920, 2020, it's honestly not that much different. We are still in a space for individuals who are literate, who have literacy skills, who can read, who can, maybe they previously could write if they acquired their injury, they may, can type. So honestly, the systems look very much like they did when they first started. They're alphabet-based typically. Like this one is really interesting because the layout isn't a QWERTY keyboard layout, which a lot of people expect it to be. It's not an A through Z layout. This layout is really specific to the frequency of a letter coming up in a word. So it means that you'll have less difficulty kind of having to navigate from letter to letter to spell a word. So
this might as well be based on Scrabble.
Kind of. I mean, it's actually a really efficient system for certain users. Like if you're a scanning user, like a switch scan user, there's just way more opportunities to have to hit a button less or hit some sort of switch less. So it reduces the amount of friction, but this is not great for every user because of course, once you've met one speech generating user, you've met one speech generating user. So,
but this is interesting.
But this is a unique system.
So this is a soft keyboard in essence that could be ported over to desktop, and somebody with a scanner actually could use it on desktop, for instance.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely customizable for sure. And like across devices. Absolutely.
Interesting.
And then we have verbally.
Right.
So also 2020-ish, right? Or this is another example of a device. So same concept, it's phrase banking, word banking, text prediction. You can save phrases and things here as well. And then typically these are designed to have more of the common words you might say or describe right at the top. You'll notice that's where all those main words are. You can totally customize those. And then you've got your QWERTY keyboard at the bottom. So I would anticipate this would be someone who's probably typing or has the physical capability of typing or swiping. depending on the device. Yeah. So this one's, but they're still very similar to that 1920s board.
Right. So
phrase banking.
So these are text-based sort of systems. So let's kind of transition, and then maybe let's talk about some icon systems. So this is where it gets real interesting.
Oh, that's
really
a really good way to put it,
generation specific.
I've heard you say other words to describe this. Interesting is a new one for you, I think.
Wait till we get to Egghead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is the most classic symbol use. And honestly, I'm just going to say, if you are an adult who was literate, who perhaps had a stroke and struggle to read and make sense of words now, this is the symbol system you would have. So just think about that. You're a 50 or 60-year-old person, and this is your symbol use. Okay, let that sink in.
For me, as a former creative director, as a fussy designer, like if the lack of physical ability didn't make me want to off myself, having to look at this would absolutely do it.
Yeah,
it would be just such an insult to my intelligence.
Not just having to look at this, but that limiting your communication to those, to such simplicity. It takes away the precision.
Oh, you have no idea. So we started getting into this whole conversation about like what is core vocabulary and what isn't, and what's allowed on the board and what isn't. And you start getting to some really hairy sort of ethics there in terms of what do you want to include and why. But then you start getting into interesting things like the when. Okay, that has an analog clock interface that chances are our kids and our our grandkids wouldn't be able to understand without difficulty, or if at all.
But it does then beg the question though, right? Like where is the level of age diversity in this that we need in symbol systems, right? Because adults like you, me, others will recognize that as and associate that as time.
Okay. Oh, Marcella is saying that the more looks like coffee beans, and Jonathan says it's cherry tomatoes, and I would vote for rabbit turds.
Actually, I like Kristen's.
The pomegranate.
Yeah, that's what Kristen thought.
It's totally pomegranate seeds.
Or it's getting on Thanksgiving, the cranberries, okay?
Okay, fair. Yeah, these symbols are, I mean, here's like a slight step up, I guess. I love that you usually call the other ones the eggheads, but I mean, you're going to see some more eggheads in the near future. But yeah, this is just a second iteration of the PCS symbols from before, the last ones we just saw. They're like slightly more advanced, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. But I think, was it Todd that said something about like, it's really limiting? I mean, it is really limiting because it's also really requiring this like really isolated like vocabulary that's really heavy on use of nouns, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of problems we'll talk about with that too later.
But I feel like that's when I try and speak in Spanish, I've got like 30 Spanish words. This is probably similar,
Yeah. It's really, I don't know. It's rough. It's rough, you guys. Help us.
But I mean, I have to give these guys props for coming up with some that are just so abstract, like go and more, are abstract that you have to do some sort of metaphor. And the problem is that the metaphor isn't necessarily universal. And you're having to come up with so many metaphors, and there's so many more than we deal with in software that it starts creating all kinds of challenges.
Yeah. Well, is that really the assumption that all of these are intended for the same level of disability or type of user? Because I know a close friend who has a child who's like 4 years old and he has autism, and they have these pictures on that fridge, and he doesn't speak, but he can go there and he can point. Right. So it's like how much.
That's a great question. Yeah. It's a really good question. There's a lot of really complex layers to this. As a speech pathologist, from like my training and my understanding of like language development, all of that, my immediate thought is we have to give people more. Like, we need to give as much language as possible, because if we just stick to a few pictures on a fridge, how are you ever going to model language enough for a child to learn a robust vocabulary? If we're hiding language and context from them, how will they grow? How do children who use verbal speech learn to speak?
Oh, Allison
You
has
just
an
give them
excellent
3 or 4
question.
words at a time? Oh, sorry, yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. But she has an excellent question, which
Oh.
is, are the systems fixed or customizable? And
Depends.
but
would
they're
say it depends on the
mostly
system.
customizable. And
Yeah.
we're going to get into how and what the
Yeah.
limitations are, and
Yeah.
the weird ethical issues that
Yes,
raises.
lots
too.
of them. But I will say they are mostly customizable, but we will talk about the paper ones, because that's a nightmare.
Okay. So
And those are less customizable.
we're looking at semi-realistic people here. So next, let's look at symbol sticks.
Being so kind, Claudio. I've never heard you talk so kindly about these symbols.
So we're describing this as cyanide and happiness, but without the humor.
Yes.
So imagine just reading cyanide and happiness with just no text. And
this is like the egghead too. Yeah, I mean, so this is symbol sticks, and this is a system of symbols owned by a company called News to You. The other symbols we were looking at, the Boardmaker PCS symbols and the PCS thin line, those are owned by a company called Tobii Dynavox. So
they're the big 800-pound gorilla in the business.
Correct. It's a lot of money. Actually, well, we'll talk about this during the insurance part of this conversation, and it's not cheap. It's absolutely not cheap.
Right. So
in other words, I like that for someone to understand any of these, they definitely need to read, for sure. Right?
Well, not necessarily, but it helps if you can read, right? But it doesn't, they add the language to the bottom of it as a support or as a way to help also bolster literacy skills. But they're recommending for a lot of people who are born with a disability that would potentially impact their verbal speech, right? They do start introducing devices as early as 1-2 years old. Obviously, people can't read at that point, but you're starting to get your understanding of like those one-to-one symbols and your environment and context, right. And that's really important too. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the other thing, Marcella, I mean, from UX design, like, it's one thing to try to understand an icon, but it's another thing, icons and text, when you pair them, they're unambiguous. They're really most easily understood, and it's the most efficient way of transferring information. So this is kind of what we're looking at here. But we're looking at a proprietary version of this. So words don't get added to this vocabulary unless that company wants to draw and produce it and distribute it in the next release of their software.
I see.
Right.
And so in my opinion, it gives, the manufacturer far too much control and far too much power over the language. The other thing is, somebody else were to want to develop an open source system, like say for use in the third world, they would still have to license this and pay for the right to use these icon libraries.
And they're expensive.
I find really that so problematic.
All right, so let's make a note on that. So all of these that you're showing, they are proprietary. They are expensive, right? So
they're very expensive.
Okay.
And actually, to add to what you were saying, Claudio, it even takes it another layer deeper where we'll go back.
Okay.
It sounds like we need to build an open source version of this, right?
Who said
open
that?
source icon library.
The talk is over. That's it. Good night. Thank you.
All right, drop the mic. Drop the mic. Let's talk about open source.
Sorry, I'm late to this game. I don't know if you guys are like, if that's like old news. You're like, yeah, Todd, we've been talking about this for 6 years.
I was building up to tonight. Yes. Thank you. We're how many minutes in? And there. Okay, spoiler.
Spoiler alert. I would say the other really, really kind of messed up thing about it is like, so we're thinking about this in terms of the user, right? So they have these symbol sets as a part of their device, and that costs money, but usually it's wrapped into the cost of the physical device itself, which is also included, hardware and mounting and blah, blah, blah. if I, as a speech pathologist, want to be able to create materials for my student who uses these symbols to either do what you were talking about, Marcelo, about adding them to a fridge or in the environment in general, I would have to pay a separate licensing fee to do so, because it's technically breaching like whatever rights they have if I were to crop the image, cut it out, and attach it to a door or something. So like, you're just kind of, most speech pathologists will go in and screenshot and do all sorts of things, but you can't actually get access to these symbols unless you buy them. So schools are not the greatest place for having tons of money to throw around. And we're talking like hundreds and hundreds of dollars, depending on the system, like hundreds of dollars a month, hundreds of dollars a year. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So Andrew
Thank you,
has an interesting question. They are proprietary symbol systems, but how entrenched are they? And are they protected by patents, which might be a barrier to an open source version? So
well,
what do you have to say?
I'd hope we'd create a version that has nothing to do with this, right? So maybe we could patent our
better,
better.
Right.
Yeah. But
Maybe
yeah,
the
they do
patent
have
has
patents
specific language, talking about an egg-headed character,
But I mean,
these questions are getting
even
even better. Oh my God, Andrew McPherson has one that we're going to get to about how hard for somebody to switch systems. So, ooh, okay, you guys are definitely on the right path here.
I'm so excited. Good call. Great
So you ready for Min Speak?
Oh man, I guess so. Is anyone? I don't know.
Okay, this is interesting. This is where you start getting into semantic associations and stuff. So this is more for literate students, right?
No. This is not more for literate students necessarily. So the system we're looking at now, so prior to these, all the other symbols we were looking at really had like one-to-one correlations. This has more of a one-to-many correlation, right? So you see a symbol, and if I were to show you like on the bottom, across the bottom bar, the fourth one in from the left is an apple, right? So if I said to you, apple, what are some words that come up in your head related to apple? What would you say?
Red.
Food.
Fruit.
Eat.
Tree.
Right?
Yeah. Teacher.
Exactly.
I'm seeing them come in on chat.
yeah, exactly. Pie. Yep. Okay, banana. Interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
Banana. Nice job, Mop.
Great example of how we make word associations based on an image. MinSpeak is a system that was built by the company Prentke-Romich, and they created the system that's supposed to have the one-to-many correlation. So you see an apple, you think all those things in your head. So when you go to select the apple, you have all of those options available to you that are semantically associated. It's called semantic compaction. It's a linguistic thing that we do naturally because our brain organizes language in such a way, just as you guys, experienced right now by saying that. And so if you go to that page, it will open up a page that has more pages on fruit, on eating, and it will have the different conjugations and everything associated with that. So you don't have to be literate for this. You do have to have some sort of understanding of language association with symbols, right? So you have to have a vocabulary. A lot of people say you can build vocabulary out of this. I honestly would agree that this is a great tool for teaching association, but I have had very little success with a lot of my students previously in terms of seeing this through as a complex communication system. So I have seen it happen though. I've met people who use this very well, efficiently, effectively, but it's, in my experience, not as common as other systems or using prediction and things like that. So it's a much more complex system. And it's got some, I know we were talking earlier, Claudio, about like the dog come. That one's an interesting one.
Oh yeah, and he's got a newspaper in his mouth. I was like, no, sorry, that's fetch. That's not come. That's like
I thought it was a fish. Okay.
So we're picking this apart, but I mean, let's just step back a little bit more meta and maybe talk about like the color coding and how you start trying to introduce things like pens. You're starting to introduce like paintbrushes in the purplish color. You're introducing comparative and superlative endings to your adjectives. So you're
Absolutely.
trying to deal with things in grammar that are like another level up in terms of complexity.
Yeah. And every system does it differently. So we'll see some other systems that have different ways to conjugate verbs that are a lot easier, but don't necessarily, for someone who's cognitively in a space to think about like verb conjugation, you know, it won't mean anything to them. So the color system here that you have is, there's two different versions. There's the main one, which is called the Fitzgerald key. And then there's like an offshoot of it, which is like the Gausson's crane, and I can't remember whoever else did it. But the Fitzgerald key is much more complex color system. So the yellow usually means like nouns, pronouns, people. The green are usually verbs, blue are usually adjectives, so on and so forth. And then the Gausson's crane one is a variation of that, sort of similar, but less colors. There is a question in the chat about being colorblind, and you are 100% correct. It's a huge bummer. I had a lot of students who had cortical visual impairment or color blindness in some way, and that made that very challenging. So, you know, there's like a perspective on this that really, you know, a lot is missed. So it's customizable, but it's also like there's a reason why we use the colors to kind of help for some students, but it's not really, it's also very abstract. So when it comes to conjugation, like the painting symbols here, those are adjectives or like ways to kind of describe different things,
Right.
and so, or descriptive words. So thinking about painting something, you're adding a color, so you're changing it. So that's where your semantic correlation comes from. So it adds this layer of like, man, you really have to like think about a lot. And then you add color on top of it to like start thinking about, you know. But then I always challenge the idea of how useful is that anyway? Because how often, unless you're a linguist, do you go around really necessarily like labeling all of these things? At some point, it becomes way more important to have your motoric, like your physical memory of where things are, than it does your visual, like color-based memory. So if and you'll see the devices are usually set up so that you've got, you know, if you're building a sentence, you start with a person, then an action, then a description of some kind. So it's also built up like a linear sentence. And that motor pattern for that is much more, like much quicker for a lot of people to know. My people are always over here. My actions are here. My adjectives are here, you know, and moving through that way. It's interesting.
So I kind of see this sort of, you know, I'm looking at the chat, I'm kind of seeing like we're kind of dancing around this thing of like, you know, are we building bespoke language systems where basically you're creating a language of one, or a language that only exists within a certain household or within a certain care setting?
Well, and I think that gets into the issue of like when we were talking about what would you do for an evaluation, right? And one of the questions on there was, is this person independent or do they have a caretaker? Because really, when you're evaluating a need for somebody to have a certain kind of device, the problem you really run into is if the caretaker is not very adept at technology and can't really figure this out, this device is not going to get used. So you're kind of running into multiple issues. It's less problematic if you're kind of thinking about it as if you're an independent person with the device. Really, this is a device that utilizes speech output. So someone wouldn't be like using this to communicate with you, so they don't need to know the language. But when you're talking about instruction, and honestly, how many speech pathologists are just ill-equipped to teach on these devices anyway, it's like truly unbelievable. So yeah, there's a layer of it being very like elite in some ways. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but kind of.
Right. Well, I'm sure we're gonna get like deep into this whole discussion as to like, okay, who should be the decision makers on this? Like you're making 9 decisions that are being made by speech language pathologists. So it's kind of like, okay, people who don't necessarily have a knowledge of technology or tech stack or how user interfaces work or user experience or doing user experience research are making top-down decisions based on their knowledge of the human brain or of human speech. And that starts kind of like evolving a whole set of questions. And can software designers even pretend to do this sort of set up these sort of systems if they don't have advanced science degrees? So I'm going to leave you guys with those questions to kind of stew over them, and we're going to get back to those. But let's you know, we've got such good stuff to get to. I want to make sure we have time to get to it and linger on it. So, you know, we danced around this whole issue of research. And so what is the state of the art when it comes to research? And then the bigger question is, what sort of feedback are you getting?
I'm going to loop these together into one, in that the research in itself is highly focused on language outcomes, semantics, how we organize language and understand language. And honestly, it has nothing to do with the user perspective. I think that we're going to talk about this a little deeper, but I'm just going to broach it now, but there's a layer of ableism in this community, in the speech pathology community, the special education community, the healthcare community, that seemingly kind of puts this idea in that if someone has this type of disability that limits verbal speech or creates difficulty with verbal speech, that they have no opinions or that they can't possibly,
or it's not worth anything.
Insight.
Because somebody who has a speech issue doesn't have an advanced science degree.
Right. Or it's just, there's an even deeper, sadder layer to it that they wouldn't understand, even if there's absolutely no cognitive disability related to this, or even if there is, right? There's a layer of, why would someone with a cognitive disability not have an opinion about something? That's insane, right? So we need research, and we need researchers who are empathetic and understanding and are able to design research to elicit information from the widest array of users, including your users who have more complex needs, who utilize these devices.
So do you want to, I know we have the next slide with the lost voice guy. And I can't remember why it was that you wanted to bring him up, but he's a hoot.
I wanted to bring this up because we often also get questions. We, as in, like, I would always get questions about the voices that are used on the devices themselves. And I thought this was just a great way to kind of like provide some insight into that, because some of them are awful. Some of them are great.
So this is him going like, why I have the voice I have, right?
Yeah.
The alternatives were not much better. I didn't really want to sound like this.
And I really didn't want to sound like this.
And I'm not the type of guy who can sound like a gangster rapper.
Have you found that people treat you different before the show as compared to after?
That's a really good question, because I've never really thought about it. But I think they do, yes. I don't think they realize I'm going to be performing when they see me beforehand in the bar or whatever. So I think it surprises them when they see me get up on stage later on.
What are some of the reactions you've gotten that just make you laugh?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
I actually got asked if I was a character act after one of my shows once.
Oh.
I just can't understand.
Hello, ableism.
Yeah, so let's explain this. He won Britain's Got Talent.
Yep.
He won an entire season of this. And he's a stand-up comedian, and he's an AAC user, and he doesn't speak. And his shtick is hilarious. And if you can find it on YouTube, you should. So look up the Lost Voice guy on Britain's Got Talent, and it's amazing.
He's really funny, and he kind of just puts it out there, but he also really provides, if you like take his sketch for what it is, you'll get what it is, but there's always a deeper layer there, and he addresses ableism head on. But it was like perfect. And even just this example, the fact that people think he's a character act, oh my God, like we've got to do better. So speaking of ableism.
Oh yeah, speaking of which, so you never ran into this, I'm sure, in your 11 years. Never ever.
Claudio, I left speech pathology partially because of this. So this is a heavy one, but I really did not want to be a part of it for a lot of reasons. I'm still a speech pathologist. I'm still licensed and certified, but my goodness, this is rampant in the speech pathology community. How speech pathologists view their clientele with disabilities, but also just like AAC users in general, like constantly questioning, like what we just talked about with research. Well, why would you ask the student what they think? They can't even tell you. It's like, well, no, oh my goodness. So, you know, like I've had situations where speech pathologists or special educators and sometimes parents who just, because the devices cost so much, will just say, oh, they're probably going to like drop it or break it, so I'm just going to hold on to it for them. I'll put it on the shelf, or I'll give it to their caretaker to hold on to it. And it's like, well, then that defeats the purpose of intentional communication. So there's a lot of assumptions that are placed on our AAC users, and a lot of them are deeply rooted in ableism. And if you go through a speech pathology program, it is 2 years of significant ableism being taught to you unintentionally, straight up implicit bias, but still bias nonetheless. So it's something that I think about a lot, but I really think we have to view this through a lens of ableism because it impacts the designs that you see. It impacts the way that students use their devices or don't, or adults. There's so many problems. So it would be hard for us not to talk about it.
So there's the issue of misjudging the intellectual level of who's there. So you like, you know, if they can't speak, then they're a dummy, and you can say whatever you want around them, and you're treating them like their intellectual capacity is far lower than what it is. But then there's a whole, like, how much effort do you want to put into it? And if you really don't feel like, you know, feel very passionate about what you do, I mean, I guess you kind of limit the language that you're introducing because it's more
automatically. Yep. And you get fearful when you see a device that's got a bunch of buttons on it. You freak out, when in reality, if you think about it, we learn language by modeling. If you limit yourself to 4 words on a screen or 8 words on a screen, you're limiting the amount of language input you're providing a child or an adult who's using AAC, and you're limiting the amount of times they see someone using language just like they'll be using language. There's a bunch of statistics that look at like how many words a hearing child who will use verbal speech hears in a day, and how many they're expected to kind of provide back, and it's thousands. And then there's research that was done on how often a child with an AAC device sees another person with an AAC device modeling for them every day, and it is 0. It is 0. So we anticipate that we just put this device in front of them and they're just gonna like go, which is just like totally wild to me, because we're supposed to be teaching language like we would to any student. And if our own lack of skill and knowledge in technology or our own ableism gets in the way, we are automatically setting our students or our people up for failure.
Well, or even not just, even if it isn't that dire, it's more like you're just reducing the amount of success that they can have, you know,
significantly,
because
the spiral effect.
You're challenging them less, you're teaching less, essentially.
Correct. Yeah. And when you think about this from the standpoint of an adult who themselves are thinking, I'm going to go back to work, or I'm going to get a job, you're then also playing into this economic issue of no longer providing them access to potentially employment. So you're standing in the way of those things as well. So there's layers to it, but it goes deep.
Wow. So, I mean, you found times where you had to like switch from high tech to low tech. So do we want to talk about some situations or maybe some different systems that we had?
Totally. Yeah. So, all right, well, a lot of the time, I guess I'll start here. Some of those high-tech versions that you saw are dynamic displays. So when you select a button, it transitions to a new page, and then you have more buttons, and then it builds a sentence at the top, and then you press speak, and it will speak out whatever you decided to say, right? So those are really high-tech situations, high-tech devices. High-tech is in an iPad or a tablet computer. What happens if it breaks? Or what happens if you're going to the beach or swimming? What happens if you're going to go into the shower or be bathed? There are certain circumstances where we want to communicate and where we should be communicating, and what an opportunity to model language at the beach, right? And suddenly you realize that you can't bring your high-tech device to the ocean. So what do? Right now, the best case scenario we have for that is to basically recreate devices like that as what you see on the screen right now, which is a air quotes dynamic display of paper, where you select something, and then based on, usually there's tabs that will have you kind of like flip the page to where you need to go next to kind of build a sentence, and then the person you're communicating with needs to like hold it in memory, as does the person, about what they're saying. And so it's there's a lot of reasons why you would have a low tech backup if it breaks, water, et cetera, but it's definitely not ideal for a lot of students or adults who are using higher tech devices.
Wow. So yeah, let's look at another sort of paper-based system.
Yeah,
this one was
cool.
was PEX.
Yeah. Oh, this one's not cool. Sorry. Let me just step right back on this one. So PEX is really, I have a hard time with PEX. So PEX stands for Picture Exchange Communication System. It is often used with students or kids with autism. And it is a behaviorist approach to language, which is problematic on a bunch of levels, but it's also incentive driven, usually with food. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's problematic. And so typically you'll see these systems when a behavioral analyst or an applied behavioral analysis analyst is engaged heavily in a child's kind of communication existence. And they'll basically put up these books with all this Velcro. And what this person does is take a picture. They usually model it for the student. They'll say, show me the picture, and they'll put it on the Velcro. And then they'll say, repeat, the kid will take it off the Velcro. They'll put it on the Velcro, take it off the Velcro, and put it in someone's hand. And then they'll usually get like a Cheerio or something like that. So they're reinforcing a behavior of receiving images, not so much growing language. I've very rarely ever seen this work well. So this is a whole other system. Paper.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine this working in any sort of time frame that would even approach human speech. It'd just be like flipping stuff, and by the time you're done with it, you have like little pieces of Velcro stuff all over the place.
And it's all making requests. It's like, that's the part that really drives me nuts with this. One of the things is that like, we don't just go around requesting things all the time, right? That's not like rich communication. So it's just,
unless you sit in restaurants all day long.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it's just, well, you might as well be in this point because you're just getting food constantly. It's often reinforced by food. So talk about deep ableism. PEX is one of the deepest ableist systems I've ever seen.
Okay. Do you want to look at this? This one was fascinating.
This is cool. Yeah.
Because,
this is an interesting way.
You're on. Terrell, is there somewhere special you're gonna go this summer? You? Yes. No. The BAHOMAS. The Bahamas? I don't think you're going to the Bahamas. Are you going to another place that starts with a B?
So I'm going to stop that there because there's so many interesting things that I saw to this video. Like the fact that he starts with UM and then yes.
Yeah.
So it's like he's starting his answer with yeah. So he's already got this sort of attitude where he's setting the tone for what he's saying. So never mind that he can't spell the Bahamas. And then he starts with a B, and he I think he can almost see that she's going in a different direction. And then he hits no, like to kind of bring her back. So
shut her up.
And it's like you're watching this guy, this guy's brain working, in the sense that he's second guessing his or basically outmaneuvering his caregiver there, which is amazing. And the rest of the video is kind of like this too. So you know, the other thing is you saw you had like that big pad there. And so this is super low tech, but it's big and bulky. It's like having a whiteboard that, you know, you're going around with. So this probably goes to your point, like, you know, getting through the house with one of those.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't see if at the beginning, was this his wheelchair tray? Did you catch that?
Oh, if he was in a
I'm not
chair
sure.
or not?
Yeah,
That was the impression I got.
Okay, I thought so. What's really interesting is initially when I saw this video, yeah, it looks like the wheelchair tray.
There we go.
I wonder, and this would just be me speculating, but I almost wonder if like this was a transition period of either this person had been evaluated for a device, and we'll talk about what that's like, but it takes about 6 to 12 months to get a device after evaluation. So sometimes you come up with really unique and fascinating ways to give communication in the meantime. But so this almost looks like a haphazard communication system while like waiting for a device or after a device is broken or something like that.
But he's rocking it.
Yeah, he's using it.
He's absolutely, you know, like, you know, in command with that device, which is amazing.
In his prep school uniform or something.
Yeah, I know. I noticed that crest. It was like, I'm like thinking like the brother from the Prince of Bel-Air, you know?
Yeah, he's at prep school, so yeah.
Carlton?
Yeah, Carlton.
Okay, so let me jump ahead. Okay, here we go. Another paper-based AAC. Okay, so sorry, you know, here we are low tech with our videos too.
Yeah, and this one's kind of a great explanation. It was just like a visual of how you'd move through the paper-based system we saw earlier. It's really similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference between this system and the one you showed us is that the one that you showed us looked like it just came out of Kinko's with like the spiral bound and stuff.
Yeah. And basically, she's just kind of going through to showcase like how to construct a sentence. But again, like usually if you're in a situation like this where you have a low tech system, if you were their communication partner, you would be repeating out loud each word that they're going through, which in some ways it's just like, it's great that we have higher tech solutions so that that's not necessarily having to happen, because there is some of the user feedback we do have is that people want their own voice. So it's a bit disempowering to have someone else speaking essentially for you. And then to Allison's point in the chat, someone constantly second guessing you or like interrupting you or kind of like assuming what you're going to say because it's slower than what they'd want. So yeah, there's a lot of tricky things with paper systems. Clunky.
Yeah, I wonder if this was the way people would talk in the Stephen Hawking house, or if he would just go on these sort of soliloquies and stuff.
I think he had a lot of phrase banking, like a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna move ahead. And
she's just
flipping.
I have to make a quick comment because this is fascinating. Yeah. It's like
hi, my name is Lisa Tim.
You're opening up like a chest of things that we didn't know about. At least I'll speak for myself. This is like
like a Pandora's box, or
exactly.
You know, let's get a can opener and just open that can of worms with it.
It's a can of worms with problems.
Yeah, absolutely. We need more thought here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, here we go.
It's a great opportunity. Oh, touch chat. Yeah.
Typical touch chat.
This is a very common use.
I'm going to mute her because she doesn't say anything of value anyway.
Yeah. Touch chat is like one of the most common systems you'll see that's available on several different platforms, but usually you'll see it on the iPad. And it's this is like a mid-range system. There's also systems that have smaller buttons that are much, there's like 84 sets and so on and so forth. And touch chat does come in English and Spanish, and I think there are several other languages now. And touch chat's really interesting, generally speaking. Like it has its phrase banking and it has its traditional setup, like, you know, most devices do, but it does have a really interesting scene display area where you can take a picture of something and add hotspots for communication. So you know, it's got some additional features that are really neat, and you can edit pronunciations, which is actually really cool. So it doesn't say the robotic voice as like weird names and such. But anyway, bye, Todd.
Todd, I'm so bummed that you can't stick around for the rest, because it only gets better.
I know. Please include me on building out an open source solution. I recommend we just knock it out in a hackathon one weekend. Like get everyone on this call, and we'll get like everyone at Boca Code, and we'll just like crush this out in a weekend.
Let's talk about that, Todd. Let's talk about that. Let's make this make a hackathon out of this.
That's what I'm saying. We can maybe even get some corporate sponsors, you know, like get Office Depot involved or something, and McDonald's, you know, like throw a little money at this and just crush it out, right?
Awesome.
Maybe we can get some users, you know, to tell us what they think too. Some research on this. It'd be cool to find out. But thank you, Todd, for being here.
Yeah. Sorry, I got to run. Kelsey, it was so great to meet you, and I hope this is like the first time of many that we coordinate. Claudio, I'll see you next week. Marcelo, so good to see you. And everybody else, thank you. And Saida, you know, I love you.
Take care, man.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
I have a question.
Cool.
Yes, go, Regine.
So I'm new to this, but I have a friend that use this kind of program, but sometimes it takes her a little longer to say what she needs to say. So I would say if there is a better solution to make it easier for her.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head with that one. Like, I think that's a common issue that we face in this world, in the world of AAC, is it's clunky. And I think that's where we need broader perspectives, and we need insight. And then that will help us to hopefully utilize newer technologies that can help make these things more efficient. There are some people that you will see blow AAC out of the water with their systems. It's far more rare to see that than to see people more kind of like being able to use it, but it's not efficient. So her experience is actually very common, and it's really unfortunate. And I think it just speaks to the need for some focus in this area. We need to put resources here. We need to talk about it and bring light to it.
So do you want to dive in a little bit more in terms of how it actually works, like on a more complex sort of AAC, like one of those, you know, that somebody could rock?
Well, usually I see people rocking it when they're individuals who are literate, because we have better technology for text-based communication than we do anything else. People who have phrase prediction set up on their devices usually tends to work out pretty well. People who are also leveraging their devices for things like environmental controls. You'll see some people get really, really interesting in terms of like utilizing multiple systems. So like connecting devices to interact with other things like Alexas and things like that. And then you'll see people who utilize multiple switch systems. So if everyone can remember back to the very like first or second or third picture, Claudio has the picture of the person sat at his computer with the jaw switch.
Right.
And then it was, so he had a jaw switch and a byte switch, which is actually really interesting because I found when I was working in England that there were multiple switch setups that you could have and multiple switch inputs you could have, and you could map your switches to do different things, but it was incredibly efficient. You can only move your head in one direction easily, but if you can move your head and byte simultaneously, you suddenly have so much faster of a system. So if the switch does one action and the byte does another, then you're like moving much faster than if you had two switches and you were going back and forth. So people come up with really incredible ways, innovative ways to make that kind of interaction faster. And those are the people that I see kind of like zooming through conversation without a beat.
So let me just make one point about this in one word, which is frictionless. So this is all about reducing the friction and the amount of effort it takes to be able to interact with the device. And this is something that, you know, because AAC has kind of gone its own weird path, you know, it's kind of gone through a way different evolutionary tree. A lot of these sort of mainstream technologies that exist elsewhere don't get worked into AAC. And
Absolutely.
it's criminal. And in a lot of situations, they find themselves having to reinvent the wheel and having to redevelop something that's already out there. It's open source, it could be applied. And it's so frustrating to see this.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're talking about like that integration of like, even if you were to find a system, it's needing those tech people to be able to like understand how that system could be implemented on a person's device, right? So it's like also that layer that's missing, like, but I can't even say how many times we would pull in like a computer science teacher or like a janitor to help us, a custodian to help us to like, whether it's the hardware or the software, to try to like figure these things out, because it's amazing how much money you pay and how little support out of some companies you really get.
Wow.
So you're just trying to like do what you can. Yeah.
So this gets you to a whole weird issue, like too, like, okay, you go through, you build this bespoke device for somebody, and they'll keep it and they'll run it into the ground. I mean, they'll have it for like 10 years, longer than you would probably have, you know, any other sort of device, because you're afraid to switch to something else. So
a lot of people are, yeah.
When that device finally dies, you're not going to find an exact replacement for it. And
a lot of them, yeah.
And if you've got a bespoke system, that the data that's on that is not portable to another device. So you basically have to build a new device from scratch to kind of try to match whatever was in that device that broke in the first place.
Yeah, you got to Frankenstein it. Something. Yeah. There's a lot of complexities. This is like one of the most interesting areas, and the most awful and ethically problematic. So let's talk school age kids first, because that's really, in some ways, the more complex. The question was something different, but I'm going to start here and we'll get to that question. But basically, Medicaid is the driving force for most devices for school age kids or young adults. And Medicaid, on average, funds new devices every 5 years. I think we're all in tech. We know that tech changes very rapidly, and 5 years is actually a lifetime when it comes to a lot of these devices. And some of these devices and their systems cost upwards of $65,000 to $150,000. So Medicaid funds these typically when you go through this pretty extensive evaluation process. Someone like myself and others will write up pretty extensive reports. We put that through trying to justify the medical need. That's what it has to be. And then depending on what state you're in. So when I was doing these pretty extensively in New Hampshire, the turnaround time was anywhere between like 2 months to 6 months. If you were in Texas a few years ago, it was sometimes 1.5 years, 2 years. So it's also state dependent. So then you're 2 years ago to a device that you got an evaluation for. Now you're 2 years out and have to wait 5 more years to get a re-up to do an evaluation to get another one, right? So there's problems with that system. Then there becomes the issue of if you are a person with a certain disability that really needs or could benefit from a speech generating device, but you don't qualify for Medicaid. So you have private insurance for your parents or whoever. That ends up being a whole other ballgame, because a lot of private insurance will turn down funding speech generating devices because they won't say it's a medical need, despite evaluations and support that says otherwise.
Kelsey, so how expensive is a typical device?
It depends on the type of device. So for a student who maybe needs mounting systems and who needs maybe eye gaze or switch access or some other kind of different type of access, they can be $65,000 to $150,000 easy. For a student who maybe has full mobility and needs more of a verbal kind of speech output device, and you can kind of set them up with an iPad, then the cost of the iPad plus the cost of the licensing fee, which sometimes will be reoccurring. So for the life of the device, you could be paying per month or per year for the cost of your software. So it depends. It totally depends on the company and the hardware that you're using. So it's very costly. which is why insurance tries to get out of it as much as they can.
Wow.
And then adults are another story.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a lot of hoop jumping for the families, for the kids who have to sit through all these evaluations, all these questions, all these things, people watching them, like seeing what they're doing. It's not a great way to build self-esteem or self-worth. So yeah, it's problematic. And so the question that was initially posed was, well, can you go back one slide so I get it exactly how it was?
Because what do you have to do if someone switches devices?
Okay, so then it becomes, oh man, so I will say this because this is a really important thing. I've had students who have a particular disability and medical need for a device, and then they have a medical complication that happens, and it changes the trajectory of their capabilities at that point. And so maybe they've had their device for a year, and then perhaps they had a stroke or something, and now their abilities have changed. I have had Medicaid deny requests more than times than I can count for a medical change that necessitates a different type of device if it's inside of that 5-year window. So there's been like crowdsourcing that happens frequently for this. Sometimes schools will pay for it, but then the school owns the device. So what if you move? What if you graduate? What happens? How are you going to fund to communicate so you can get a job? There's so many layers to this on an ethical level that just scream, we need a way to do this that's self-esteem, positive and like not so ableist and that's efficient, and funding is not a problem. We need that so badly in this world.
So that's interesting because we haven't began talking about the emotional deficits that these people go through. Like when things change, they were doing so well and something changes, right?
Yep.
Can you talk about the emotional, I'm not sure if you're gonna have a slide on that, Claudio.
I don't think we have
I don't have a picture of somebody going over a cliff on this deck, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to talk about. When you think about a lot of these families, these parents or kids or adults who are kind of now having to navigate this system that's really built to do everything they can to not spend, yes, it's tremendous. And they're often very isolated and passed around from doctor to speech pathologist to physical therapist to all the different people, and there's no one really supporting this idea of like a medical home of sorts where everything's managed in one space and supported really seamlessly, because you're constantly fighting for your existence and your own validity in this. And I think that's really demeaning, and I think it's completely inappropriate when we're talking about people who have a right to access these things, and they feel it and they know it. And I think it's really interesting that we don't ask them about it.
I mean, Kelsey, everything that you're describing means that the only, like what I'm hearing, it says the only sort of family that would succeed in something like this would have like a 7-figure income. And really more, when you should be designing this to work with an orphanage in Latin America, with the tiniest and the most threadbare of funding, and it just it just doesn't, like, if anything screams for like, hey, we want an open source sort of approach to really make this affordable, really make this available and sidestep this broken ass system here. It's just
and how can we do the same for hardware? So software is only a piece of it, right? How do we also find ways to make the hardware that the software goes on affordable and usable by people, and the equipment that they use, the assistive technologies that integrate into that hardware? How do we create systems that don't cost $65,000?
It's hard for me to fathom that the software, the software that essentially is a digital version of paper applications on an iPad would be worth $65,000. I can't fathom that. I think eventually somebody from the industry is going to watch this and they're just going to hate us for blowing the cover on this.
I mean, if you think about certain, when you start adding like mounting systems and eye gaze systems and all that stuff, it just adds up and adds up and adds up. And sometimes reoccurring costs associated with certain softwares and software. It's just, it's really fascinating.
Oh man. All right, let's try to skip ahead to something that's a little bit more positive, okay?
Okay. All right. Okay.
Let's pull out the smudge stick, you know, wave it.
No toxic positivity here, Claudio. No toxic positivity here.
So UX designers, software designers, if we were going to build a new AAC system, if we, blue sky, could just say, ignore the whole industry, we're just going to build something, screw them, we're going to sidestep them entirely, be revolutionary here, what would be the requirements to this? So your requirements, first and foremost, is you want it to be frictionless. You know, so whatever you do, you have to have multiple modalities for people being able to point, to be able to choose words, to be able to interact with it in a way that's easy. And as a matter of fact, you want it to be predictive as well. So you want to take advantage of predictive text and that sort of thing. You want it to be mainstream. You don't want to be like, what fascinated me about this in the first place was it was like some weird journey that this one technology had taken. And I kind of felt like Darwin discovering the Galapagos here. Like, you know, here's a bunch of blue-footed boobies and, you know, these tortoises that have evolved incredibly differently and separately from the rest of the world. And like, that's no way to run a business or way to run software. So, you know, you have to come back to this, you know, from a place where it needs to be mainstream and it needs to work with established tech and established technology stack, you know, and it needs to follow basic principles of software design. Like the data has to be portable from one device to another. You need to be able to save your settings into, like, you know, a JSON file or XML or what have you. Yeah, it needs to be accessible, Allison, and it needs to be interoperable with other devices, because everything that you've described, Kelsey, is like total vendor lock-in. And you know, and then you start getting into this icon library, which is probably the biggest piece of intellectual property that you have in this. And that icon library needs to be expandable. It needs to be multicultural. It needs to work in different culture sets. You know, we talked about how the software needs to be rugged enough to deal with beat situations and that sort of thing. But again, it needs to be mainstream. So these are kind of some top level requirements, you know, kind of put constraints around, like, hey, if we're doing an open source project and we're taking this on, these are definite things that it needs to meet. So I'm going to try to move quickly through the next slides to talk about, like, okay, what could the future look like? Well, the future could look like the last 2 years in stuff that we've developed in software and hardware. So this is a device by Tobii, one of the main manufacturers, and it's got basically a rangefinder underneath the screen that shoots infrared and it tracks where your eyes are. So this is a really, really good eye gaze tracking device, and it's remarkably precise. And that rangefinder bar that goes underneath has a lot to do with it. And I think the list price for that was what, like $700 or $800 now, for which is
for eye gaze.
Yeah, for just the software device. You know, I mean, I have this opinion on open source that essentially, like, if you have the hardware, you should open source things so that a 19-year-old kid in his mom's basement could actually develop the next generation of this software, just like Linus Torvalds developed Linux. And it should,
because that hardware is like $5,000 to $8,000.
Get out. It's
that bar right there.
It's a rangefinder.
Yeah, it uses just basic infrared technology to track your eye patterns. It's anywhere between $5,000 to $8,000. Like,
okay, that's
the ones
MSRP.
that are more accurate. Yeah,
MSRP. It's probably worth about 100. But so let's get into software libraries. I mean, here's a software library for head tracking where you use your face and you can use gestures and stuff like that. This is open source. So
and there's another one that's Camera Mouse. If you have a Windows machine and you want to go download something right now, go download Camera Mouse. It tracks a point on your face and you can navigate your computer using Dwell It's pretty interesting. It's open
Oh,
source.
is that the one where it was
cool.
like the silver dot in the, between your eyes?
No, that's expensive. No, this one's open source, and this one, you basically choose a part on your face. Like I usually choose my nose, and then you just move around your computer, your nose becomes your mouse, and then you dwell on items to click or double click, etc. Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. But this is not the only one. I mean, there are a ton of these sort of
Yeah, there's a lot
out there. They're open source libraries. They're probably node projects that you can work into.
Yeah.
That you could work into your own project. So there's no reason why we should have this sort of vendor lock-in. It's more like the only reason this is happening is because the rest of us haven't discovered this, and we haven't built competitive enough products against this. So let's go to the more exotic.
Biohacking.
That you can tap directly into your brain. So essentially this goes underneath your skull, sits exactly in a grid on top of your brain, and then has like the sort of wires that come out that then can go into a speech generator. So essentially what you're doing is you're having the sensation and the thought of moving your mouth and all of the muscles inside of your mouth. And this is going to a speech generator, which is then generating the words based on this.
Yeah, it's mapped to that. Like there's like this phoneme chart about how we make sounds. So again, would have to be mapped to all different types of languages.
This is a proof of concept experiment. So it starts getting to this whole interesting thing like, okay, well, if it's a proof of concept, do I really want these guys, jacking into, my brain directly? And, are they going to have to like go back in for an upgrade? Or, it starts raising all kinds of issues. Like you can count me out of this.
Well, I think that this group should have someone come in to talk about biohacking.
Oh, we totally need to do a biohacking night. Oh yeah,
absolutely.
And all the ethics around this.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's a deep dark hole there when you go down it, but we got to find some people who are really into biohacking because they have a lot to say.
So, predictive typing, machine learning. Okay, could get a little bit interesting like this. You type in grandma and then what comes up? Or I want a, and this goes on your previous search history. So, but joking aside, I mean, you could have predictive typing and use machine learning where you really work, get to learn the end user of this and get to predict based on them. And this starts empowering them in ways that a caregiver couldn't learn this well enough, or they'd be injecting too much of themselves into that.
And we talked about this too, Claudia, how great it would be to have this be context driven. If I'm at Applebee's and I type something in, please make it easy for me to geolocate where I am so that it's a little easier to kind of know what I want to talk about. So if I'm at Applebee's, maybe I just really want some nachos and I don't want to talk about my boyfriend. So I think there's definitely some opportunity.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, being able to, because the whole thing of like reducing the vocabulary to what you need based on the context is a key factor in terms of reducing the friction. So instead of having to flip through dialogue after dialogue and getting to something, this is more about getting to the words you want as quickly as you can and as predictable as you can. So,
and just like being able to choose who your communication partner is. Oh my God. Just so that people, oh man, I have so many thoughts, but keep going. Sorry.
All right. So let's
hang on. That's something really interesting what you just said.
Okay. You want me to go with that?
No, let's talk a little bit about that. Like being able to choose your conversational partner. How do you explain that?
Communication partner.
Communication partner.
So basically, like, meaning if I'm sat at Applebee's, right, and I have my geolocation on and it knows I'm at Applebee's. If I also mark who I'm with and it has learned my general conversations, things we like to talk about with that person, you've identified who your communication partner is and what your conversations usually are and where you are. And so contextually, your vocabulary will be more reflective of the things you might be interested in talking about.
Okay,
which would be
I'm
really
with mom.
cool.
I'm not dropping F-bombs. We're not talking about
Yeah,
sex.
exactly. Exactly. You could get to it if you wanted to, but it's not going to be the most populated stuff for you to choose from because it's likely you're not talking about
And how
it.
do you usually find these communication partners? Is there like a marketplace, or is there you have to go through social workers? How is that found? How's that person
So
found?
I'm just thinking like anybody. So communication partner being like whoever you're talking to. So like if I go, yeah, exactly. So you would have like some sort of context programmed into your device that like, here are the people that I frequently interact with. And you could like tag that essentially into your device saying like, okay, I'm with Marcelo at Applebee's right now. I don't even like Applebee's that much, so I don't know why I'm so like up into this.
Because you're from Massachusetts, that's why.
Oh man, but yeah, so the context is much richer. My device knows me more, and my communication will likely be more efficient, or it will start to learn the things I talk about with this person when at Applebee's. You know? Yeah.
Interesting. That's a whole other dimension of like who.
Oh, but it's definitely
ways of
important
detecting.
for
That's like
research. Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Fascinating.
Kelsey, I have to say, it's like you like don't go away. Just stick with this community because we're definitely gonna get something. Because your knowledge and your experience in this field is crucial for us to come up with something that can even start, rolling. But I think that's thank you so much. I think a lot of people are saying.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Go ahead.
I appreciate it.
Go, Claudio. I think you.
How do I follow this without being a total buzzkill?
Yeah.
Oh man.
Oh, there you go. Blush.
Here we go. Pablo Stanley. Give him a shout out. So this is a system of illustrations, 2D illustrations with body parts. So essentially you can break down these vector illustrations to their body parts. You can recombine them, you can pose them like paper dolls, Barbies, what have you. But essentially this is an illustration system where you can create all kinds of illustrations from what you have. And they're very multicultural, but it's not just one illustrator. In Blush, you have a number of different illustrators in completely different illustration styles. So what I'm picturing something like this is, okay, that whole egghead library, with 5,000 core icons, 37,000 plus in total. I mean, if you're going to rebuild this, you could do something like that by using, using an illustration library like this. So this is out there. It's available. It's just come out in the last year. This is a technology. But the way I was thinking something like this could be used is, some of you guys are probably familiar with Font Awesome, an icon library where you're specifying icons through the first few revs were through characters, and now they've grown to entire words because they have, Marcelo, what is it, like 2,000 core icons of like 6,000 icons in Font Awesome?
Yeah, 5,000 and growing. So
it's insane. So if you had a system like Font Awesome where you're specifying the body parts, or you're specifying a particular pose, and then you're specifying, and then combining them in illustrations that show something like Go or something like that, you could have a system that's recombinable, and you could change the characters in there. So if you're in a country like Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country, and you're trying to show something, where damn this thing. Sorry. Where you're trying to show characters that have more modesty and stuff to them, then this is a potential alternative. So, but what would be the end result of something like this? Imagine you could create 37,000 characters or illustrations to show different things. Who says that it just has to be left to the AAC community? Because essentially what you could be creating is the next generation of emojis. So think of this. I mean, and this is like so many other technology products that have been out there where you build them, you build something for people with disabilities, but it benefits everybody else in a very profound way. So I kind of see this sort of outcome that if you start addressing these icon libraries with verbs, emojis right now are mostly nouns.
Yeah.
And
verbs.
so
we need more verbs.
Exactly. So if we can create these recombinable glyphs and stuff with these enormous libraries that people understand, you've essentially reinvented the emojis.
Can I add something, Claudia?
Sorry?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Because this part is like really interesting to me for a million reasons. The word was corpus callosum from earlier. So I have a student a while ago, and I love this emoji idea because, and I think it's really important, and I think this could go really far, and I would love to see something like this happen, because I've had a number of students who were not literate, or in one example, I had a student whose both sides of his brain didn't speak to one another. So he was unable to recognize symbols and associate them with meaning when put together in words. So he would communicate it through text with these emojis, right? But they're so limiting, to your point, Claudio, like they're just not robust enough. So how cool would it be to be able to send a text of emojis, right? And have that translated into a sentence when it reaches the other side. So this person could communicate with his friend who is also blind, who maybe a string of emojis that have like some text base to it wouldn't necessarily make sense, but if it's translated into a contextual meaning, into a sentence of some sort, it's almost like predictive emojis, but with context that are verb driven, action driven, association driven. I think it would be brilliant.
Yeah, once you start getting into like creating a usable glyph system that's recombinable and not etched in stone and not locked behind copyright and intellectual property laws, there's no limit to the sort of places something like this can go. So that brings me to the last point. Todd, you're not here to enjoy the fact that you just totally spoiled this. My last slide. Which was like, yeah, let's do something open source. Let's start something. What can we start? What can we do with this? Here, we talk about how designers and us UX designers really can change the quality of people's lives. Hello, here is exactly a project where you could do exactly that. So, let me lay that out there for you guys.
And so many more people, like there's so much possibility.
Yeah, so we do have time for some questions, right?
We have all the time we want.
Yeah.
But one quick thing before we start getting into the Q&A is that we have the next slide in this, and I'm going to post this slide deck. If SlideShare lets me do it, I'll put it on SlideShare. If not, I'll post a link to it on the meetup page. But Kelsey's taken the trouble of putting together a whole series of links. So for those of us who want to dive deeper into this, you have a series of links and a series of jumping off points for you.
One thing I'd say, Claudio, for safety, because of what we talked about before, if you post these anywhere, I would remove the images of symbol sticks and so forth and just link out to where people can find examples. Just as a heads up, because they'll be coming.
It's that proprietary where they would go after us for violating copyright?
I would 100% just recommend it.
We're just promoting them.
Yeah, no, or the other alternative is we link to a still. We link to a still on YouTube. So essentially, we're embedding their YouTube.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, just my 2 cents. But there were some questions in there. I saw that.
This is.
Where am I?
What do have you guys unmute and just start asking questions?
Yeah, I think that would be
Andrew.
Better. Andrew had a couple of questions. Let's. Is he still around? Yes.
Andrew, it is so amazing to see you here. I cannot believe it, and I don't even want to know what time it is where you're at right now.
Thank you for being here.
Oh no, you must be muted. No, we can't hear you.
We can definitely hear him now.
How's that?
Hi.
Right. Yeah. It's a bit past midnight. It's gone midnight.
Oh, wow. Thank you for being here.
I hope it was worth staying up.
Trying to remember what my questions were.
You asked about customization.
Yeah, so what I was thinking there was, it was during this business of how much it costs, and part of that is just the fact that it's proprietary, and the conversations about medical insurance are just baffling to me, because the rest of the world works. But yeah, the idea that these costs are artificially driven up. And so what I was thinking, we kind of got there later on with Claudio's slide about it working with the generic hardware and software tech stack or components. But it was a question of like, how many of these systems are just taken off the peg? You know, you've spent $60,000 and that's the system you're going to use, versus, hang on, I've spent $60,000 and this isn't really cutting it for the user. Do they need to change it? Do they need to tweak it? You know, how flexible are these symbol systems? Are they, can people make up their own symbols?
That's a good question. It's a good question. So if you purchase, so let's start with the symbol side of it. If you purchase a symbol-based system, like, so maybe you purchased the, there was the touch chat one that had like, it wasn't quite the board maker symbols, but the symbol stick symbols. So like still eggheady and all of that. On certain systems, especially ones that you can utilize on an iPad, or like Tobii Dynavox has some devices that are like the big eye gaze system devices. Depending on which software you purchase, there's some capability to go into like a particular icon and to change the colors, to change, like, to flip things to be inverse colors. You can also like change the background colors. And then in some you can draw over them too. And others you can upload, replace the symbol with an actual photo of something. However, we do frequently recommend to not use photo specific symbols, because those are far more complicated to translate to multiple meanings for efficiency's sake as you progress through learning more language, than a symbol that's not directly tied to like a one-to-one complete correlation to something. So there are systems, and that's part of the evaluation, is, are we going to really need to customize this in some way? Given what we have available to us today, when it lands in our lap, how are we going to set up the vocabulary? I'm a big fan of to touch it as little as possible. The system you get is really the system. You shouldn't be messing with it. Of course, you're going to add some like fringe vocabulary is what we call it. So words that aren't a part of the core itself. So the core is made up of like 85% of the most common words that people use in English. And then we call the fringe everything else. So context driven stuff. So I'm a big fan of, really, speech pathologists shouldn't be messing with these devices all that much. Because we're supposed to be building language skills. So it depends on the user, it depends on the situation, it depends on the software and the hardware that they're given, and the needs of the person. I hope that's helpful.
Yep.
Cool.